In this final chapter, we will cover the end of the Kursk Incursion and draw the last set of conclusions about the operation. To see the full picture, make sure you watch the previous parts. By now, the operation has entered its 7th month, with both sides fighting tooth and nail. The Ukrainians, who captured most of the land in the first months of the offensive, are heavily exhausted. Still, the chance to pin down Russian forces and inflict disproportionate losses drives them to hold onto their positions in the Kursk region. The Russians, on the other hand, continue to pour resources into their counteroffensive, desperate to mitigate the deep humiliation of being invaded themselves after years of trying to defeat Ukraine. So far, the struggle has managed to stall the Russian push towards Pokrovsk and has already drawn North Korean troops into combat, where they suffered heavy casualties. Yet, now it's only a matter of time before Ukrainians retreat completely from Kursk. The remaining question is whether the withdrawal will be carried out in an organized way, avoiding encirclement and preventing a possible Russian deep breakthrough into the Sumy region. Coming back to the battlefield, on February 6th, exactly 1 month after the previous tactical counterattack, Ukrainians launched another mechanized assault to regain lost positions in the Kursk region. This time, the mechanized column departs from Kolmakov, bypassing Cherkasskaya-Konoperka with the goal of dropping infantry in Fanaseyevka. Overnight, before the assault, Ukrainian engineering equipment was actively clearing the grey zone area from landmines and even established a mechanized bridge on the key route inside the village of Kolmakov. Apparently, the Ukrainian command also slightly corrected the approach since the last counterattack that was quickly mitigated and now uses significantly more vehicles. However, once again, the emphasis in attack was made on proper use of cages, jamming and engineering equipment. Ukrainian Bergepanzer II and Vincent I MC vehicles, with the support of tanks, make paths, form ramps and IFVs in the field, bypassing a few Russian positions there and avoiding mine draws. Russian radio-controlled FPVs are either all jammed or are not used at all, while fiber optic FPVs inflict modest losses, destroying a few MRAPs, and one Ukrainian T-64 hit 3 times before being abandoned by its crew. Despite that, the group of MRAPs with Ukrainian air assault forces spearhead into Fanaseyevka along the road, bypassing reinforced positions in Cherkasskaya-Konoperka. After the infantry takes a foothold in the village, enemy counterattacks are repelled, unlike months ago in Verdun, where Russian infantry prevailed. Overall, the operation, while being risky, drives a significant edge south of Sudzha, but does not really change things strategically, remaining another purely tactical counterattack. It's important to note that because every such counterattack of Ukrainian forces is usually labeled by many war observers as a new major counteroffensive, when it reaches its tactical goals, it's immediately recognized as a failure. Yet, such advances provide a temporary relief for forces, allowed to cover up troop rotations, for example reinforcements for the 61st Mechanized Brigade, and raise morale. Still, strategically, Ukrainian positions remain weakened here, with defense mostly anchored on 33rd Assault Regiment. After all, Russians are already using fiber optic FPVs inside Sudzha due to past advances towards the city, degrading Ukrainian logistics daily. Drones also actively target Ukrainian artillery, inflicting heavy losses on it. Fortunately for Ukrainians, a steady stream of domestically produced Bogdana self-propelled howitzers covers up these losses. On the western flank, the 155th Marine Brigade comes back to the front line after a few months of recovery due to being virtually destroyed, along with 810th Marine Brigade. North Koreans also return after a certain break, as Russians use what was left of them mostly in the northwestern part of the salient. The newly arrived Chimera drone unit provides Ukrainian troops with enough support to repel most of the attacks there. At the same time, the overall picture increasingly shows a gradual withdrawal of forces from the Kursk region. Apart from 501st Marine Battalion, it's difficult to identify all specific units involved in gradual retreat, but under relentless drone pressure and political constraints, Alexander Syrsky has no illusions that the operation is nearing its end. Thus, his attention also shifts towards Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians not only managed to halt Russian advances, but even execute several sharp counterattacks, using elements of Syrsky's assault regiments not engaged in fighting around Kursk. This in turn places the fate of the ongoing battles in the north into the hands of Brigadier General Alexei Shandar. As a deputy commander of the air assault forces, Shandar has participated in the planning of the Kursk offensive, though he remained overshadowed by Syrsky. The commander-in-chief directly controlled nearly every unit in the area, with the close assistance of the Chief of General Staff, Anatoly Bargilevich, and a regiment that had made both the rapid initial advance and the subsequent strong defense possible. The fortifications built around small Kursk villages and along the border were organized primarily by Major General Dmytro Krasilnikov, who assumed command of the Operational Command North after Shandar was promoted to lead the Operational Tactical Grouping of Forces Siversk, fighting in Kursk region. By February 9th, Ukrainians regained control over several positions on the western bank of the Malaya Loknya River. At the same time, Russians, having finally established reliable crossing over the Snagost River after a month of fighting, advanced towards Sverdlikovo. It quickly becomes clear that their success is not due to sheer luck, but the result of redeploying a significant portion of their grouping to this sector. This shift also explains the sudden Ukrainian gains near Malaya Loknya, which had long been the focal point of the Russian efforts. Now, the focus clearly moves to Sverdlikovo. On February 10th, Russians further drive a wedge in Ukrainian positions there, forcing Ukrainians to respond by redeploying the elite Timura Special Unit of Defense Intelligence. This allows to slow down the advance, but heavy combat right in the key village continues as of February 13th. Worth mentioning that losses of previous months of mechanized assaults significantly affected the Russian equipment stockpiles. Now, they switched to small infantry groups, as reserves of armored vehicles perished during the fall campaign. The exceptions, however, also happen. On February 16th, the 155th Marine Brigade launches the largest assault in months, attacking Ukrainian positions in Nikolsky with a mechanized column. This time, Russians actually arranged vehicles in proper order, as the column is headed by the T-80 BVM with additional armor, mine plow, and a bright Soviet flag on top. 4 BTRs closely follow the tank, this way avoiding landmines. While still moving through the gray zone, the column is attacked by artillery and FPVs of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, and due to lack of jamming, 1 BTR-82 is immobilized. Russian troops inside disembark and start running across the flat field towards Ukrainian positions. Soon, another BTR is taken out this way, once again forcing the infantry to attack by foot. Same fate awaits another BTR that closely follows the tank. The Russian T-80 BVM, being the most armored vehicle out of all, almost reaches Nikolsky, detonating a number of mines, but after multiple FPV hits, finally comes to a halt. One of the surviving crew members leaves the tank, likely wounded, but another FPV drone ends his suffering. Ukrainians also execute a few extra strikes on the tank to make sure it's completely destroyed, and switch back to one lucky BTR that started retreating after the first losses were taken by the column. Soon, it's located by FPVs and also burned down. As much as this assault is typical for Russians, there are a few small observations that are worth mentioning. First of all, the return of North Koreans was likely the reason why the Soviet flag was used. As Russians, unlike Ukrainians, do not use any digital battlefield system, they have to rely on visual symbols to differentiate between friend and foe. Before, these were large ZV and O letters. However, the only easy symbol that both they and North Koreans know well is Soviet flag, thus the decision to use it on the first vehicle on the column. Judging from the astonishingly terrible operational planning, which yet is not surprising after all that we saw in this series, we can conclude that the command of the 155th Marine Brigade is simply unable to learn from their mistakes. Replenished with men and vehicles after disastrous defeats, they repeat assaults in the exact same way that inflicts maximum casualties. Even the fact that Sergei Yefremov, vice governor of the Russia's Primorsky Krai region and commander of the Tiger Battalion of the brigade, was killed on February 2nd, did not force them to rethink their approach. Unlike near Malaya Loknya, around Sverdlikovo, Russian VDV forces continue methodically expanding the wedge, reaching the border here by February 20th. The attempts to cross it, however, are stopped by timely redeployment of the 78th Air Assault Regiment. By February 22nd, Russians also push Ukrainians out of recently captured Fanaseyevka. Since the capture of Sverdlikovo separated a small part of the salient to the west of Sudzha, by February 24th, Ukrainians start a slow retreat to the border there, despite concentrating Marines as well as Rangers to mitigate further advances. The defense here crumbles as Russians also intensify assaults in the northern part as well as in the area of Kurilovka. That way, by February 25th, Ukrainians further lose Pogrebki and, most importantly, positions around Sverdlikovo. By the end of the month, they retreat to the border in a separated portion of the salient, this way more reinforced and easy to defend. Full withdrawal of the 21st Mechanized and 3 more brigades was another reason for that. Overall, Russian successes are explained by the fact that they suddenly shifted focus to a less reinforced part of the front line, namely Sverdlikovo, instead of burning hundreds of vehicles in assaults near Malaya Loknya, and started actively targeting Ukrainian logistics. The latter becomes relevant only when the Russians' extremely bloody assaults allowed to reduce widths of the salient to approximately 20 kilometers, which means that any logistical vehicles in it can reliably be destroyed with regular FPVs. This is why positions to the north crumbled too, as Ukrainian troops in Malaya Loknya are mostly supplied and rotated out of combat through the single key road that is currently under constant drone surveillance and strikes. We already mentioned similar issues with Sudra, but there, Ukrainians at least have urban buildings to hide vehicles, while the western part of the salient consists mostly of villages completely leveled down by aviation. On March 2nd, Russians continue to pressure Ukrainian western flank, as every new kilometer of advance exposes more and more already vulnerable supply lines to constant drone strikes. It's also worth mentioning that Russians gradually accumulated all their best FPV drone teams, such as Hateful Eight, Sudoplatov's battalion, Kaskad, Bobar and Rubicon here, withdrawing them from the other parts of the front line. If in 2024 strikes on Ukrainian logistics in Kursk were irregular, most of the key roads were simply out of drone reach, now the situation has drastically changed. Since the end of January, Russian multi-frequency and fiber optic FPVs, as well as various winged strike drones, make constant ambushes on supply vehicles and effectively control all the roads in Kursk and partially Sumy regions. Essentially, Ukrainians now use the only supply line through Sudra, which Russians quickly turn into the road of death for logistical vehicles. Ukrainians try to mimic the Russian anti-drone measures by turning key supply routes into corridors protected by nets, but it's quite late. The mud that comes together with warmer weather only makes the situation worse. By March 5th, Russians also crossed the Psel River in the area of Kurilovka, further continuing efforts to encircle the Ukrainian grouping with paralyzed logistics. Worth mentioning that all these events coincide with the US administration blocking deliveries of already ordered aid to Ukraine to pressure it into negotiations. So, around this time, the Ukrainian command likely makes a final decision to completely retreat from the Kursk region. Such an operation in given circumstances is one of the most fundamental challenges for the Ukrainian command, and personally Alexander Syrsky, the author of the Kursk Incursion. After stabilizing Pokrovsk, he again has to jump to micromanage the area after fairly disastrous months for Ukrainians there. The last such retreat was executed near Avdiivka, where it was necessary to redeploy the whole 3rd Assault Brigade to the crumbling flanks to hold them. Now, the situation is less critical than there, but the Russian command already has a plan to make it such. Once again, mimicking what happened in Avdiivka a year ago, Russians decide to use underground pipe to infiltrate behind Ukrainian lines. This time, instead of sewer, they use the pipes used to transport natural gas. The mission, named Operation Pipe or Stream, however, is set up for failure from the very beginning. First of all, Russian volunteers in the Kursk region started looking for diving equipment and oxygen cylinders before the operation started, which was noticed by Ukrainian command. Sections of the pipe are also apparently filled with various condensates and tar, which makes breathing in them highly dangerous. Nevertheless, the Russian command, expecting to repeat the limited success of such operation in Avdiivka, sent over 100 men through the pipe in the first wave towards Ukrainian positions 15 kilometers away. The underground assault force is made from soldiers of the 30th Motor Rifle Regiment, 11th Air Assault, Veterаны and Vostok brigades, as well as Akhmat Special Forces Regiment. On March 8th, the first Russians crawl out of the pipe to the north of Sudra, expecting that they are already behind Ukrainian lines. However, they find no Ukrainians who left this area earlier. Suddenly, they are hit by heavy artillery fire. Under a combination of regular and cluster artillery shells, troops cannot advance into Sudra and retreat to the abandoned village of Kubatkin. Out of 800 men in total, not all of them survive though, as many choke to death or simply receive heavy poisoning with pipe tar. Judging from the videos, only a few soldiers have protective equipment, so it's not a surprise that in few months the reports will surface that operation survivors are usually not making it out in hospitals. Approximately a company of pipe infiltrators were also wiped out by artillery. The dangerous advance towards the border from Kurilovka further signals that Ukrainian forces are retreating in the area south of Sudra. Yet, the rear guard formed from the elements of the 33rd and 225th Assault Regiments, along with 253rd Assault Battalion, inflict heavy losses on North Korean units there, halting their push towards the border. Similarly, Russian attempts to advance in the area of Zhuravka also fail. Yet, the border there is crossed, which clearly shows that Russians desperately try to encircle what was left of the garrison. Despite mounting pressure on the flanks, strained logistics, and infiltration through pipe, the Ukrainian withdrawal continues as planned. It's worth emphasizing, however, that relentless Russian drone pressure remains the primary challenge and complicating factor throughout the process. At the same time, Operation Pipe simply cannot have any meaningful impact as there is no footage of Ukrainian troops even engaging Russian infiltrators. Thus, the positions there were likely abandoned long time ago as troops focus on holding Sucha. In public perception, however, the Russian narrative once again reversed the importance of pipe assault and drone pressure, turning a clearly suicidal mission into a tale of heroism. Meanwhile, Russians reclaim many positions in the northern part of the salient, which are already abandoned for some time. Since the roads remain extremely dangerous, most of the Ukrainian armored vehicles were evacuated earlier, while troops in many places have to retreat on foot. This, unlike assaults on foot, in some cases might be even safer, especially as Ukrainian infantry tries to move at night and along the forests and tree lines. At this point, the vehicles that try to cross the border are burned down in minutes, day or night. But what footage does not show is any major engagements, meaning Ukrainian retreat proceeds as planned. By March 10th, most of the grouping is evacuated and takes new positions in the Sumy region, while Russians continue to advance through abandoned settlements. The claims of the Russian command and Putin himself about thousands of captured Ukrainian soldiers, as usual, are not backed up by any evidence, as Russians can hardly demonstrate even a dozen of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Eventually, by March 16th, they recapture Sucha and take a solid foothold behind the border in the area of Novenke, while also facing resistance near Guyevo. The river crossings there are actively bombarded by Ukrainian aviation, and vehicles are hit by drones, so they cannot quickly reclaim this land. Overall, by the end of the month, battles continue around Oleshny and Guyevo, which remain the last Ukrainian positions in place of initial salient. Various cross-border raids are also launched by both sides, with the goal of tying down the forces of each other. By the end of April, Russians mostly pushed their adversary from the last two villages held, declaring on April 26th that the whole area of the Kursk region is liberated. In reality, Ukrainians continue to control positions along the border as well as attack in places like Demidovka. Russians also soon push into the Sumy region with their grouping. However, they reach only tactical gains, capturing a few destroyed border villages and stopping, just as in the course of their 2024 Kharkiv offensive, about which we also made a separate video. So, at this point, we can draw final conclusions from the Kursk Incursion and try answering the question of whether the operation was successful or not. First, let's start with the idea behind it and set of likely goals. As discussed earlier, the Ukrainian original grouping numbered at most about 15,000 men and struck in multiple directions. The distribution of forces makes it unlikely that there was a plan to seize deep Russian territory, Kursk, Lvov, or Kursk nuclear power plant. Claims that those were the true objectives lack supporting evidence. From everything we discussed, the most logical list of goals Alexander Syrsky likely had in mind during planning is as follows. First, Ukrainian forces had to cross both Russian defensive lines, the border line and the main line about 15 kilometers inland, and secure key high grounds and towns such as Sucha and Korenevo. The attack has to be shocking not only to Russian public and command, but also to Ukraine's allies. A dramatic operation would expose Russian weaknesses in defending its territory and its declared red lines. That in turn could push allies to increase support for Ukraine, above all by greenlighting the use of Western long-range missiles against targets on Russian soil. Second, a large number of surrendered Russian soldiers could be used in prisoner exchanges. That would put Russia under pressure to negotiate. In this scenario, Ukraine, riding the momentum of success, could present a set of demands together with all its allies, and in particular with the incoming US administration, regardless of the election's outcome. Those demands would likely center on ceasefire and major land swap. Russians receive Kursk back in exchange for occupied parts of Ukraine. If Russians agree, Ukraine gets extra time to rework its problematic command and control structure, as well as give some rest to the armed forces and improve fortifications everywhere. If they decline, they will be blamed for sabotaging negotiations in front of the whole world, and will have to waste a huge number of resources and troops to first annihilate and then retake open land instead of advancing on Donbass. If we step away from speculations about political goals and return to the battlefield, the Kursk offensive also had to serve another purpose. It was designed to force the Russians to move reserves from the east to the north. This would slow down their territorial gains and give Ukrainian troops temporary window to strengthen their fortifications and replenish their ranks in the region. At the same time, the offensive had to boost morale. After 2.5 years of fighting on Ukrainian soil, the war had finally been brought back into Russia. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, also claimed that Ukrainian incursion was a preemptive strike against the Russian grouping that planned to advance on Sumy. However, the evidence in the form of the units we saw on the Russian border prior to the Ukrainian attack clearly indicates that this is not true. More plausible additional version, voiced by Zelensky, is that Russians also planned an advance on Zaporizhia, but cancelled it due to Kursk Incursion. In any case, these were likely just formal justifications, and the real goals of operation likely aligned more with those listed above. Now, let's assess whether the goals were reached. Politically, the Kursk Incursion was yet another major humiliation for Russia and proof that Ukraine is still capable of advancing. This notion effectively lifted restrictions on using most of the Western long-range missiles, as well as all other kinds of equipment on Russian soil. In the process of incursion, Ukrainians successfully used the element of surprise to advance fast and deep, especially compared with praised by many recent Russian successes in Donbass. After that, the attack force took a number of solid positions like Sucha, but the failure to capture Korenevo was detrimental to the grouping in the long term. Exactly from Korenevo, Russians were launching the majority of their successful counterattacks, and unblocked the land corridor to Glushkovo, which was also on the verge of collapse at some point. This misstep emerged mostly from the lack of forces in the very beginning, but this also could be attributed to the mistakes during the planning phase. Politically, the fact that Ukrainians controlled a large section of Russian territory was one of their strongest cards at the negotiating table. However, the United States' decision to begin peace talks with Russia semi-independently, rather than in full coordination with Ukraine and Europe, essentially threw that bargaining chip away. Ukrainians, however, had to face the repercussions of this decision, holding off under attacks with rapidly declining US military aid, and eventually leaving the region. In terms of diversionary value, however, the Kursk operation had undeniable impact. Russia redeployed significant forces to the area. More than half of all its Marine and VDV formations took part in the bloody assaults there, instead of fighting in Donbass. This included 2 full VDV divisions, 2 VDV brigades, 2 Marine brigades and 1 more Marine regiment. They were supported by over 10 other brigades, as well as between 12 and 15,000 North Koreans, backed by more than a dozen separate motor rifle regiments, and Russia's most advanced drone units. All of this equipped with the best available technology, from armored vehicles to cutting-edge fiber optic drones, was diverted specifically to Kursk. Against them, Ukrainians held out for 7 months with only about 10 mechanized brigades, 1.5 tank brigades, 3.5 air assault brigades, 4 separate assault regiments, roughly a dozen of territorial defense battalions, 1 Marine brigade and elements of the Special Operations Forces. If these units had been sent to Donbass, they would have been only a drop in the ocean amid massive groupings, and forced into costly attritional fighting. In Kursk, however, they for the first months created a maneuver battlefield, where Ukrainians consistently outperformed the Russians, yielding far greater value. Specifically, the beginning of the operation itself deserves a place in military strategy books. Ukrainians managed to covertly concentrate a small but sharp blitzkrieg force in the era of complete drone domination, something deemed impossible. Most importantly, they defeated and captured the bulk of the initial Russian grouping that held the border, an achievement often overlooked in the shadow of the eventual retreat. That retreat, however, was anything but a rout. It was carried out in an organized manner, as evidenced by the fact that Russians failed to achieve even a minor encirclement or capture more than a handful of Ukrainian troops. Instead, the same rugged Ukrainian grouping re-emerged in the Sumy region, where it inflicted staggering losses on the Russian forces. Despite throwing in immense manpower and equipment, the Russians not only failed to destroy the Ukrainian units, but also fell far short of their next objective, never coming close to threatening the city of Sumy, just 30 kilometers away from the border. The Kursk offensive as a diversion did not completely halt the Russian advance in the southern part of the Donetsk region. However, in long term, it significantly slowed Russian gains, particularly around Pokrovsk, where Ukrainian forces even managed to launch several counterattacks, demonstrating that the city, whose fall had once seemed inevitable, was far from lost. Russian manpower losses during the Kursk incursion were staggering, due to the nature of their repeated frontal assaults, and especially when factoring in heavy casualties suffered by North Korean units. They were at least several times higher than Ukrainian ones. For over 6 months, Russians were on the constant, mostly poorly planned offensive, reclaiming what Ukraine captured in less than a month. Yet, Ukrainians paid for initial speed and eventual withdrawal with high vehicle losses, most of them inflicted by drones during resupply and rotations, not even assaults. In this video we already touched on fiber optic FPVs, and without diving deeper here, it's also worth underscoring the quality of Russian drone operators. The aforementioned Rubicon, formerly the Center of Advanced Unmanned Technologies Rubicon, is far more than a single drone unit. Well financed and secretive, it links drone manufacturers, UAV training centers, and frontline drone detachments into a single efficient network. This systemic approach to drone warfare is arguably the most significant Russian military development of 2024. Since late February, Rubicon operators, thanks to the skills and cutting-edge equipment, have effectively annihilated the logistics of the Ukrainian Kursk grouping in less than a month, inflicting a large share of losses we will discuss further. Between August 6, 2024 and March 24, 2025, Ukrainians lost 790 pieces of equipment, according to the footage, while Russians 740 in the Kursk and Sumy regions. The ratio 1-to-1 in losses is considered unfavorable for Ukraine, which has both fewer vehicles in storage as well as lower capacity to produce them. However, this analysis is usually based on quite outdated data, and it's superficial. As of spring 2025, Russia mostly depleted its vast storage bases and uses way less equipment of all types than in the beginning of the war. So, since using less translates to losing less, it makes sense that Russian losses are roughly equal to Ukrainian. The composition is also important. For Ukrainians, three largest loss categories are infantry mobility vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, and tanks, 41, 34, and 9% respectively. For Russians, these are armored fighting vehicles, tanks, and transport vehicles, 58, 11, and 11% respectively. The infantry mobility vehicles correspond to only 9% of losses, compared to 41% losses for Ukrainians. All this shows us interesting dynamics that Ukrainians lost more in absolute numbers, but 41% of losses are basically armored tactical cars, such as Humvees, or MRAVs, such as Max Pros. Both types are quite easily replaceable, not only with Western aid that over the years provided literally thousands of them, but also by domestic production. Unlike tanks or IFVs, these do not require complex running gear, a fire control system, and gun with stabilization, which also makes them quite cheap. The real problem for Ukraine is that the third of losses were more rare and often Western IFVs such as Strikers, Bradleys, Marders, and CV-90s. However, in this specific category, Russians way surpassed their adversaries due to the absolutely atrocious assaults that filled the roads of Kursk region with hundreds of hulls of BTRs and BMPs. So, Ukrainian losses were high, but if we take into account their composition as well as the shift impact, and most importantly, the lives vehicles saved, when it comes to the cases of using Western tanks and IFVs, we can conclude that they are not nearly as catastrophic and do not significantly affect the Ukrainian capabilities in the long run. Further battles where Ukrainians continue to rely on mechanized assets only prove this. Russians at the same time used up mostly replaceable even in the long run vehicles out of carefully accumulated reserves likely prepared for the Pokrovsk direction. This is evident from the fact that while in Kursk and Pokrovsk, assaults were conducted with the new T-80s, T-90s and BMP-3s, in other directions, Russian troops were literally using motorbikes, scooters and civilian cars for head-on assaults. The Russian force that pushed into Sumy region in spring 2025 was almost exclusively infantry. Thus, we have to reiterate that without the Kursk Incursion, the Russian command would be more rational with how they use remaining armored vehicles, but Kremlin orders likely gave Alexander Lapin, grouping commander, a full access to strategic vehicle reserves once the decision was made to eject Ukrainians from the region as soon as possible. All this resulted that Russians were forced to exchange their scarce IFVs for mostly adversaries replaceable IMVs at 1-to-1 ratio. It also applies to the bigger picture, as instead of fighting in Donbass, tens of thousands of Russians were forced to fight inside Russia for 7 months. Instead of dropping hundreds of MPK glide bombs on Ukrainian settlements, these were dropped en masse on Russian ones, pretty much destroying all inhabited areas on the border. Instead of Ukrainian civilians losing homes, over 140,000 Russian civilians were displaced, with many losing everything they had and further putting a strain on already strained economy. And in the end, all Russians did in their campaign is pretty much restored control over ruins, gaining virtually nothing compared to August 2024. The aftermath of the operation, similar to other outcomes we mentioned, is also a topic of heated debates. Russians got a solid excuse to invade the Sumy region, but their grouping, after suffering staggering losses and immediately stripped off most of armor, quickly bogged down, especially since they failed to perform even the smallest tactical encirclement, allowing the Ukrainian grouping to conduct a successful retreat from the Kursk region. In Sumy, it's also harder to cut off Ukrainian logistics due to more forests, and Ukrainians no longer fighting in narrow salient. Their next goal was likely in line with the official one, creating a buffer zone. However, this goal leads only to further mass casualties, similar to the area north of Kharkiv. There, Russians were mostly proactive and attacked first in May 2024, just to hit a brick wall of Ukrainian defenses around 10 kilometers from the border, and failing to move even an inch forward beyond this barrier for over a year, continuing to suffer constant losses. In conclusion, the Ukrainian Kursk Incursion was an ingenious operation by initial design, proving that Ukraine, against all the odds, can regain the initiative and advance, thanks to its commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky. However, political circumstances beyond Ukraine's control, along with the limited forces available, significantly influenced how the operation unfolded. The Ukrainian retreat cannot be taken as a sole indicator of failure, since Ukraine never aimed to annex enemy territory, unlike Russia. Yet, heavy losses and the eventual collapse of logistics, which forced the withdrawal, suggest that concluding the operation earlier might have been a better course of action. These, of course, remain speculations, with the benefit of hindsight. In our assessment, the Kursk offensive deserves to be called costly and modest, but still a success, a true case of squeezing water out of the rock, and the very first blitzkrieg-style offensive of the drone era.